She was just a maid earning $12 an hour. He was the most dangerous man in Chicago, shot, betrayed, dying in a dark alley behind the city's most luxurious hotel. That night, no one saw him except her, and she chose to feed him instead of leaving. 5 years later, he bought the entire city for her. But before that could happen, blood spilled, guns fired, and his enemies came looking for her. This is the story of Zara Bennett and Luca Moretti. Please comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has progressed, and stay tuned to the end, because the ending will leave you speechless. The alley behind the Velvet Crown Hotel smelled like grease, cigarette ash, and the particular kind of cold that only Chicago produced. The kind that didn't just chill the skin, but worked its way down through muscle and bone until it felt like the city itself was trying to hollow you out. Zara Bennett had been on her feet for 11 hours. Her lower back had stopped hurting around the 7-hour mark and gone straight into a dull, grinding numbness that she'd learned to ignore the same way she ignored everything else that couldn't be changed. The supervisor who called her by the wrong name deliberately, the guests who looked through her like she was furniture, the eviction notice folded in her coat pocket that she hadn't opened since Tuesday because opening it made it real. She was 27 years old, and she was tired in ways that had nothing to do with sleep. The trash bag she was hauling weighed maybe 15 pounds. Inside it, untouched filet mignon still sealed in its kitchen foil, dinner rolls wrapped in linen napkins, 2 half-consumed portions of lobster bisque that some table of venture capitalists had abandoned without a second glance. Table 12. $6,000 dinner. They'd eaten maybe a third of it before someone's phone buzzed and they'd all stood up at once like trained dogs responding to the same signal, pulling on their coats without looking at the food, without looking at her. The waste made her stomach clench in a way that never got easier. She shoved the back door open with her shoulder and stepped into the alley. Snow was coming down sideways, the wind channeling between the hotel's rear wall and the adjacent parking structure with the kind of focused malice that made you understand why people in this city developed a permanent flinch. The loading dock fluorescents flickered overhead. The dumpsters were overflowing. Kitchen staff was behind on disposal, again, and nobody had bothered to fix the scheduling gap in 3 weeks. Zara set the bag down and reached for the dumpster latch. That was when she heard the breathing. It was wrong. Too shallow. Too irregular. The kind of sound a body made when it was running on something below reserve. Not sleeping, not drunk, but failing. She'd heard that sound once before, at 17, in a Detroit emergency room waiting area while her mother sat beside her gripping her hand hard enough to leave marks. She knew exactly what it meant. Her hand froze on the latch. She turned. He was tucked between the far dumpster and the concrete wall, legs extended at an angle that suggested he hadn't chosen his position so much as collapsed into it. Tall, even folded like that, she could tell he was well over 6 feet. Black coat, expensive by any measure, now destroyed. There was blood on the left sleeve, dried and dark, and more of it soaked through the coat near his ribs in a pattern that made Zara's throat tighten. His face was turned slightly toward the wall. Dark hair, wet from snow. His lips had gone that particular shade of pale blue that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the body rationing what it had left. Zara stood there for 3 seconds, maybe 4. She thought about the eviction notice in her pocket. She thought about her supervisor, Gerald, who had made it abundantly clear that her continued employment at the Velvet Crown depended on staying invisible, staying efficient, and above all staying out of situations that brought attention to the back-of-house staff. She thought about the fact that this man was injured in ways that went beyond slipping on ice, and that whatever had happened to him had the texture of something she did not want to know about. Then she thought about the bread in the trash bag. She crossed the alley. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected. Late 30s, maybe, though whatever he'd been through in the last however many hours had aged him past that. His face, even unconscious, or nearly unconscious, was not the face of someone soft. It was angular and severe, the kind of face that people described as intense when they were being polite and frightening when they weren't. There was a cut above his left brow that had bled and dried. His hands, loosely curled in his lap, were large and marked with the kind of small scars that accumulated over years of something that wasn't office work. His eyes opened, dark gray, nearly black in the alley's bad light. They fixed on her with an alertness that didn't match the rest of him, sharp, assessing, already calculating. Even half dead, the man's first instinct was to evaluate the threat. Zara held up both hands. She wasn't sure why. It just seemed like the right thing to do. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, which, given that he was roughly twice her size and she was holding a trash bag, she acknowledged was probably obvious. But she said it anyway. His eyes moved from her face to the bag to her uniform. The gray and white maid's dress, the velvet crown required, the name tag that said Zara in corporate block letters, the worn practical shoes. He was cataloging, deciding. "How long have you been out here?" she said. It wasn't really a question. He didn't answer. His jaw worked slightly, like the mechanics of speech were requiring more effort than he had available. Zara set the trash bag down, knelt on the wet asphalt without thinking about what it would do to her uniform, and dug through the foil-wrapped packages until she found the dinner rolls. Still warm, she unwrapped two and held them out. He stared at them. "Eat," she said. His hand moved, slowly, like it cost him something significant. He took the rolls from her hand, and for a moment she watched something fracture very briefly in his expression, something that looked almost like disbelief, before it sealed itself back under whatever hard surface he usually operated from. He ate, not gracefully. He was past the point where hunger had any manners left, and he ate the bread in the blunt animal way of a person who hadn't seen food in a day or more, maybe two. Zara unwrapped the filet mignon, cold now, but still food. She handed it over without commentary. He ate that too. She unwrapped her own scarf, wool, dark green, the one decent thing she owned that had survived the last 3 years of downsizing, and wrapped it around his hands because his fingers were nearly white, and she'd been watching him and couldn't stop watching them. He looked down at the scarf, then at her. "Why are you helping me?" Not a question, more like an accusation, like kindness was a tactic and he was trying to find the angle. Zara sat back on her heels and looked at him steadily. "Because nobody should starve while rich people throw food away." He studied her face for a long moment. Whatever he was looking for, she didn't know if he found it. Inside the hotel, someone was banging the back door against its frame. Gerald, almost certainly, who had a particular rhythm to his anger that she'd memorized in 2 years of working under him. The sound carried across the alley, sharp and impatient. "Bennett, I swear to God, you come back in here right now or don't come back at all." Zara glanced toward the door, then back at the man against the wall. He was watching her. "You should go," he said. His voice was rough, strained, but there was something deliberate underneath it now. Controlled. He was gathering himself back up from whatever edge he'd been sitting on. "I know," she said. She didn't move. What she should have done was exactly what he said. Walk back through that door, take Gerald's reprimand, finish her shift, go home to the apartment she was about to lose, and let whatever was happening in this alley be someone else's problem. He was clearly involved in something that had nothing to do with slipping on ice or getting mugged. The blood pattern on his coat was wrong for a mugging, too high, too deliberate, nothing taken. This was the kind of injury that came from someone who knew where to aim. She should have left him there. Instead, she said, "Can you stand?" He tried. The first attempt made the muscles in his jaw tighten in a way that she recognized as someone converting pain into determination through sheer stubbornness. He got his legs under him partially before his left side gave, and she caught his arm without thinking, her shoulder going under his, and for a moment all she was aware of was the sheer weight of him. Not just physical, though that was considerable, but something denser. The weight of someone who had been carrying things alone for a very long time. "Laundry dock," she said. "It's around the left side. If Gerald doesn't see us going in that way, I'm not going into the hotel. You're also not staying out here." He looked at her. She looked at him. "There's a basement level," she said. "Staff quarters. It connects to the maintenance tunnels on the north side. I know a corner that nobody checks because the heat pipe runs through it, and management assumes it's too hot for anyone to use. They're wrong." She paused. "I sleep there sometimes, when the weather's bad and I can't make the bus." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness. She didn't think this man had much softness available, but something she could only describe as recalibration. He was filing that information away. "Lead," he said finally. She led. Getting him through the laundry dock entrance took 3 minutes and required 1 moment of genuine terror when a kitchen porter walked past the far end of the corridor. But the man moved against the wall with a precision and silence that didn't match his condition. He clearly had experience with not being seen, though under very different circumstances than Zara's. The basement corridor was poorly lit, smelling of industrial cleaner and the warm mineral scent of the heating pipes. And the corner she'd described was exactly what she'd said. A recess behind a bank of storage shelving where the heat pipe ran 2 feet overhead and the temperature sat at a steady 78 degrees regardless of what was happening in the streets above. She found an old moving blanket in the bottom of the nearest shelf unit. She spread it on the concrete floor. He sat down with his back against the wall and looked up at her from this new angle. She was standing, he was sitting, which somehow still failed to make him seem smaller, and said, "You realize what you just did? I brought in an injured person who needed shelter. You brought in a man you found bleeding in an alley behind a 5-star hotel at midnight." His voice was steadier now. The food and the warmth were already doing something. "You work at this hotel. This is your job." "I'm aware. I could be dangerous." Zara looked at him calmly. "You are dangerous. That's obvious. Are you dangerous to me specifically?" The question seemed to stop him. "No," he said. "Then we're fine." She turned to go. "I'll bring water. There's a utility sink at the end of the corridor. Don't make noise." She came back with water in a plastic cup she'd taken from the housekeeping supply cart. He drank it. She waited to see if he was going to say something else, and when he didn't, she said she had to go finish her shift, and she'd check back before 6. She was almost to the corridor when he spoke. "Luca," he said. She turned. "My name is Luca." She nodded. "Zara." She didn't know the name. She should have. If she'd paid more attention to the financial news, to the talk that filtered through the kitchen about the city's power structures, to the photographs that occasionally appeared in the business section of the Tribune, she might have recognized the face. Might have connected the angular severity of his features to the gray-eyed man who had been photographed walking out of federal courthouse last spring. Every charge somehow dissolved. The legal correspondent on WGN looking baffled on live television as she reported that the case against Luca Moretti had been dismissed for the 3rd consecutive time. But Zara hadn't been reading the Tribune. She'd been working double shifts to pay down a debt that kept growing faster than she could earn. She knew none of it. All she knew was that there was an injured man in the hotel basement who needed water and warmth, and probably a doctor she had no way of getting him, and that her shift still had 3 hours left, and that Gerald was going to clock the amount of time she'd been gone and dock it from her paycheck. She went back upstairs. She finished her shift. She came back at 6:15 with 2 stolen portions of oatmeal from the breakfast prep line and found him awake, sitting in exactly the same position, watching the corridor with those gray eyes that didn't seem to miss anything. That was the first night. The 2 weeks that followed had their own texture. A clandestine routine that Zara had not anticipated and didn't quite know how to account for in the architecture of her life. She brought food when she could, which was most shifts because the food waste at the Velvet Crown was grotesque and consistent, and the kitchen staff had long since stopped tracking what went into the overflow disposal. She brought it in portions tucked under the housekeeping cart or concealed in the deep pockets of her uniform, and she sat with him for the 15 or 20 minutes she could spare before someone noticed she was gone. And they talked. Or they didn't talk. Sometimes he slept while she sat in the warm corner reading the free newspapers from the lobby trash. Sometimes he was awake and watching her with a quality of attention she'd never quite experienced. Not the way men sometimes looked at her, which she'd learned to deflect and ignore, but something more precise, analytical, like she was a problem he was working through. "You sent money to your brother last Tuesday," he said one evening, about 10 days in. Zara looked up from the newspaper. "How do you know that?" "You were upset afterward. You were calculating something on your phone for 20 minutes before you came down here. When you came in, you had the expression of someone who'd made a decision that cost them." He paused. "You live close to the edge, financially. Most people do. Not the people in the building above us." "No," she agreed. "Not them." He was quiet for a moment. "How much?" Enough. How much do you send him? That's not your business. He accepted this. That surprised her. She'd expected the question to be pressed, the way people with power usually press things when they wanted information, but he just nodded slightly and looked at the pipe overhead. What happened to him? He said. She didn't answer immediately. The pipe ticked overhead. Down the corridor, something in the mechanical system shifted with a low thrum. He was working a warehouse job, she said finally. 3 years ago. Equipment failure. They said it was his fault, which it wasn't, but they had the lawyers and he didn't. And by the time it was over, he had a permanent injury and no compensation and no job, and I was the only family he had left. She turned a page of the newspaper. So. Luca said nothing. She glanced at him and found him looking at her with an expression that she couldn't categorize. Not pity, which she would have resented. Not admiration, which would have embarrassed her. Something quieter than either of those. Like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find. You should sleep, she said. I don't sleep much. That explains some things about your face. He almost smiled at that. It was brief and a little rusty, like a mechanism that hadn't been used in a while and wasn't entirely sure of the motion. She noticed his hands were steadier now. The color had come back to them. The cut above his brow had healed to a thin red line. Whatever had been done to him at the start of this, and she'd made a conscious decision not to ask, because she could tell from the shape of his injuries and the way he listened to every sound in the corridor above them that the answer would put her in a position she couldn't afford. He was mending. Slowly, but steadily. She also noticed, though she didn't let herself think about it directly, the way he tracked every movement she made. Not with threat, with something that felt more like accounting, like he was keeping an internal record of each time she came down those stairs, each stolen portion of food, each cup of water, each minute she spent in the underground warmth of this corridor when she should have been invisible upstairs, earning her $12 an hour. On the 11th day, she came down earlier than usual because her shift had ended at 4, and she was exhausted beyond the point where the bus ride home felt survivable. She sat in the corner with her uniform still on and her head tipped back against the wall and didn't even say anything, just sat there breathing in the warm mineral air, letting the silence do what it did. After a few minutes, Luca said, "There's a man who handles your floor, Gerald." Zara opened her eyes. "What about him?" "He spoke to you for 14 minutes today at the top of the service stairs. You came down here afterward with your jaw tight." She looked at him. "You've been going upstairs." "Only the corridor, the stairwell echoes." She should have been angry at that, at the risk of it, at the assumption that he could move freely through a space that she'd extended to him under very specific terms. But she was too tired for anger, and underneath the tiredness was something else. The knowledge that he'd been listening, that whatever had transpired in that service corridor between her and Gerald had been witnessed. "He docked my pay," she said, "for the time I was outside 2 weeks ago. He's been looking for a reason, and he found one." Luca was quiet. "It's fine," she said. "I'll make it up." "You'll make it up by working more hours at a job where you're already working doubles." "I don't have a lot of other options right now." "You have more options than you think." She looked at him directly. "Luca, I don't know who you are or what you came from or what's chasing you, and I have made a decision not to know. But whatever you have access to, I don't want it. I'm not doing this for any reason except the reason I told you the first night. So don't make it something else." He held her gaze. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I said it." She didn't entirely understand what he meant. She let it sit. That night she slept in the corner of the basement for the first time, curled on the spare moving blanket she'd added to his pile at some point in the second week, the heat pipe ticking above her, and she didn't dream. She woke at 2:17 in the morning to the sound of the basement door. Not the service door she used. The maintenance access, the door at the far end of the corridor that she'd always assumed was sealed from the outside. It wasn't sealed. It was open. 3 men came through it fast and quiet, the way that men moved when they'd done this kind of thing before. Tactical, measured, wrong. Wrong in the way that people who entered buildings by their locked back doors at 2 in the morning were always wrong. Zara was already pressed against the wall in the recess when they passed, their flashlight beams sweeping the corridor in patterns that suggested practice. Luca was gone from his corner. She understood, in the 15 seconds it took the men to sweep to the far end of the corridor and back, that she was alone in the basement, that they were looking for him and not finding him, and that in approximately 4 seconds, one of them was going to turn his flashlight toward the recess behind the shelving and illuminate the 2 moving blankets and the newspaper and the plastic cup that would tell him everything. The flashlight swung. The beam hit the edge of the shelving unit, and then, from the corridor above, came the sound of a door slamming. Deliberate, loud, unmistakably above them in the hotel proper, and all 3 flashlight beams snapped upward simultaneously. The men moved back toward the maintenance access. She heard them arguing in low, urgent voices. One of them saying he was in the building, another saying it was just staff, a third saying they needed to sweep the north side now. They went out the way they came in. The maintenance door clicked shut. Zara stood in the recess for 60 seconds without moving. Then she stepped out into the corridor and found it empty and came to the conclusion that Luca had made the noise above deliberately, that he'd gotten out through the connecting tunnel before the men arrived, that he'd known they were coming before she woke, and that he had drawn them away from the recess knowing she was sleeping in it. She stood in the empty corridor breathing the warm mineral air. She didn't know what to do with that. She went back to her blanket and sat on it with her knees pulled to her chest and waited for morning. Luca didn't come back that night. He came back the following afternoon. She found him in the corner when she came down after her shift, the wound above his brow re-split and bleeding, his coat muddier than it had been, a bruise along his jaw that hadn't been there yesterday. He sat down on the blanket like a man who had used up most of what he had. Zara went to the utility sink and came back with wet cloth and sat across from him and said, "Hold still." He held still. She cleaned the brow wound. She worked carefully, without comment, and he sat without moving, watching her face with those gray eyes that never seemed to rest. "How many more?" she said. He knew what she was asking. "Enough." "Can you leave the city?" "Not yet." "When?" "When I have what I need." He paused. "Soon." She pressed the cloth against the brow wound and held it. "Where were you last night?" "Occupied." "You drew them away from the corridor." He didn't answer. "You could have just left," she said. "When you heard them coming, you knew I was down here, but you could have just run. It would have been easier." "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her steadily. "You fed me," he said. Like that was a complete answer. Like it was the only answer that mattered. She wanted to tell him that feeding someone bread and stolen filet mignon didn't create an obligation that required drawing armed men away from a sleeping hotel maid in the middle of the night. She wanted to tell him that the calculation didn't balance, that whatever he'd just done cost him something real and measurable in terms she understood: injury, risk, exposure. And a few portions of food and a wool scarf didn't cover that. But she looked at his face and understood that she was operating in a value system that he didn't share. She said, "Your stitches on the rib wound are pulling." "I know." "I'll see if there's a first aid kit in the supply closet." "There is, 3rd shelf from the left." She looked at him. He almost smiled again, slightly less rusty this time. She got the kit. She was 2 days from the moment that would end everything. The morning that Gerald would finally have enough ammunition to make his case to the duty manager, the incident that would be described in official hotel records as harboring unauthorized individuals in staff-restricted areas, the public humiliation that would take place in the lobby in front of 12 other members of staff who would stand there watching because watching was safer than intervening, and everyone in that building knew the arithmetic of that choice. She didn't know any of that yet. She only knew the heat pipe overhead, the newspaper in her lap, and the sound of his breathing in the warm basement dark. Steadier now, less rationed, more like a man who had started to believe he might have some future worth breathing toward. She didn't know what was coming, neither did he. But somewhere above them the city was already moving, the men in the maintenance tunnel reporting back to whoever had sent them, the calls being made, the net being pulled tighter. And the particular stillness of those underground nights was the stillness of the last moment before something breaks open and cannot be put back together. Zara reached over and turned off the utility light. The darkness was warm. The pipe ticked. And 3 floors above them, someone was already making the call that would end it. Part 2. The call came at 4:53 in the morning. Zara knew this because she was already awake, had been awake since 4:30, lying on the moving blanket with her eyes open in the basement dark, listening to the heat pipe tick and running numbers in her head the way she did every morning before the day started its particular kind of damage. Rent was 18 days out. The overdue notice from the utility company was 2 weeks old. Her brother Marcus had texted at midnight asking if she could cover his physical therapy copay for November, and she'd typed yes before she thought about it, and sent it before she could take it back, which was how that always went. The numbers never worked out. She ran them anyway. It was the only thing she could control. She heard the call through the ceiling, not the words. The ceiling was concrete, and the floor above was the service corridor that ran behind the hotel kitchens, but the pattern of it. Multiple voices. The urgent back-and-forth cadence of people being mobilized at an hour when nothing good happened. She sat up on the blanket and looked at Luca's corner. He was already sitting up, already listening. His eyes found hers in the dark, and she saw the shift in them. The quality of attention that had been at rest pulling itself back to full operational status, the way a blade cleared a sheath, fast, automatic. "How many exits do you know?" he said. 3. The laundry dock, the maintenance access on the north side, and the fire door at the east end of this corridor that feeds into the parking structure stairwell. The fire door. Does it alarm? It's supposed to. The sensor's been broken for 8 months. Maintenance put in a work order and nobody followed up. She was already pulling on her shoes. Standard velvet crown operational excellence. He was on his feet, moving to the shelving unit and pulling his coat from behind it. He'd started stashing it there at night instead of sleeping in it, which she'd noticed without commenting on. He shrugged into it, and the way he moved told her that his ribs were still bad but functional, that he'd assessed the pain and filed it under manageable and moved on. "You need to go upstairs," he said. "If there are people up there, you go upstairs because you work here." He turned to look at her directly. "That's your protection, your staff, you're on shift. You were in the basement because—" He looked around the corner. "Because you were checking the inventory on the supply shelving. It's in your job scope." "Is it?" "I have no idea. Tell them it is." She looked at him. He was already calculating the east corridor with his eyes, mapping the distance and the angles, and she understood that in approximately 30 seconds he was going to move and she was going to go upstairs, and this was going to be over one way or another. "Your ribs," she said. "Fine." "They're not fine." "They're fine enough." He looked at her, and for a moment something crossed his face that wasn't calculation and wasn't assessment. Something quieter and less defended, there and gone in under a second. "Go upstairs, Zara." She went upstairs. The service corridor was empty when she came through the door from the basement stairwell, which was wrong. At 5 in the morning, there should have been kitchen prep staff starting the breakfast line, the overnight porter doing his final sweep, at minimum Gerald somewhere between the loading dock and the supervisor's office, conducting his daily audit of everything he could find wrong. The emptiness had a held breath quality that she didn't like. She walked to the end of the corridor and turned the corner toward the main service hub. Gerald was there, and 2 other men who were not hotel staff. They were wearing the particular combination of dark civilian clothing and alert physical posture that Zara had learned in the last 2 weeks to associate with men who moved the way Luca moved, trained, efficient, used to operating in spaces they didn't belong in. One of them was shorter, built low and wide, with the kind of neck that meant he'd been doing weight training since he was 16. The other was older, maybe 50, gray at the temples, with a face so carefully neutral it looked like a professional choice. Gerald saw her, and something in his expression did the thing it always did when he found exactly the ammunition he'd been looking for. A small, tight satisfaction that he tried to conceal and didn't quite manage. "Bennett," he said, "been looking for you." "I was checking the inventory in the basement supply section," she said. "The count on the—" "I need you to answer some questions." The neutral-faced man stepped forward. He had an ID in his hand, held at a slight angle that showed her the badge without making it easy to read the agency designation. Federal was what she got. Federal something. "Privately, if you don't mind." Zara looked at Gerald. "Am I required to do that on shift without union rep present?" Gerald blinked. He hadn't expected that. "Ms. Bennett," the neutral-faced man said, "I'm asking a procedural question." Her voice was even. Her heart was going at about twice its usual rate, but she'd learned years ago that these two things didn't have to match. "I'm happy to cooperate with whatever this is. I'd like to know my procedural rights first." The shorter man, the wide-necked one, shifted his weight slightly. Not threatening exactly, repositioning. She noticed it. "We're looking for someone," the neutral-faced man said. "A man. We have reason to believe he entered this building through the loading dock area sometime in the last 2 weeks. We'd like to know if you've seen anyone matching this description." He produced a photograph on his phone and held it up. Zara looked at the photograph. It was Luca. A professional image, press photo, or something surveillance adjacent. The composition too deliberate to be candid. He was in a suit in the photograph, standing outside some glass and steel building, talking to someone cut out of frame. His face was the same face she'd been looking at for 2 weeks in a basement. Angular, gray-eyed, the kind of face that looked like it had decided a long time ago that it wasn't going to waste time on expressions that didn't serve a purpose. She looked at the photograph for the appropriate amount of time. "No," she said. The neutral-faced man watched her. He was good at watching. He had the patient quality of someone who had done a lot of it and knew how to let silence do the work that questions couldn't. She let the silence sit. "Are you certain?" he said. "I work double shifts at this hotel. I clean rooms, I handle laundry, I take out disposal. I see maybe 200 people in a given week, and I'm not usually in a position to study their faces." She looked at him steadily. "I've never seen that man. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful." Gerald was looking at her with narrowed eyes. She didn't look at Gerald. The shorter man's radio crackled. Low, half-heard, the burst of static that preceded someone reporting from another position. The neutral-faced man's eyes moved to his colleague for a fraction of a second, and when they came back to Zara, something in his expression had shifted slightly. Not convinced, not unconvinced, recalculating. "Thank you for your time," he said. "We may need to speak with you again." "Of course." She walked past them toward the kitchen corridor. She made it to the far end before she heard Gerald say, behind her, at a volume calibrated to reach her, "I've got some questions of my own for her, about inventory discrepancies." She kept walking. The breakfast shift started at 6, and she worked it in the mechanical way she'd learned to work when her brain was occupied somewhere else entirely. Hands doing the job, body going through the motion, the surface of her fully functional, while underneath it the calculations ran hot and fast. The federal agents were real. Whatever was chasing Luca was real in the institutional way, which was different from the hired muscle way, and in some respects more dangerous. Hired muscle wanted to hurt someone. Federal investigation wanted to document, expose, dismantle. She refilled towels in the fourth-floor rooms and thought about the photograph, the suit in it, the professional composition, press photo, which meant he'd been photographed by press, but which meant he was someone the press found photographable, which meant she'd been hiding someone in the hotel basement for 2 weeks whose name, she now understood, meant something to people outside that basement. She hadn't asked. She'd made a deliberate choice not to ask. She was reconsidering that choice. At 8:15, she was coming back from the service elevator with an empty cart when Gerald stepped out of the supervisor's office and put his body in the corridor in the specific way that meant this was not a passing conversation. "My office," he said. Zara stopped the cart. "I'm in the middle of my office, now." She followed him in. It was a small room that smelled like coffee and the particular staleness of authority exercised in a confined space. Gerald sat behind the desk. He always sat behind the desk, using it the way people used furniture when they weren't confident enough in their presence alone, and placed a folder in front of him that he'd clearly prepared in advance. "I've been doing some checking," he said. "Okay." "Inventory logs for the basement supply section show no scheduled count this morning. No count was assigned to your station." He looked at her over the folder. "So let's try again. What were you doing in the basement at 5 in the morning?" Zara looked at the folder, then at him. She'd been in this position before. Not this specific configuration, but the structure of it. The moment where someone with incremental power over your life decided to use it. She'd learned over years of service work that there were exactly two ways to respond to this moment: diminish or hold. Diminishing bought short-term peace and long-term nothing. Holding cost you in the immediate and was the only thing that had any integrity. "I was tired," she said. "It was a long shift. I went downstairs where it's warm and I rested for 20 minutes. That's it." Gerald's expression settled into something tight and satisfied. He'd wanted the honest answer, and she'd just given it to him. "That's a violation of—" "I know what it is." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you what happened. I went downstairs. I rested. I came back up. I did my job." She paused. "If you want to write me up for that, write me up." "I want to do more than write you up, Bennett." He leaned back. "Those men this morning, the investigators, they weren't asking about a missing person. I know what a missing person inquiry looks like. Those were asset recovery people. I've dealt with them before when we had the situation on the 14th floor 2 years ago." He looked at her steadily. "So I'm going to ask you one more time. Was there someone in this building, in my building?" The word "my" sat in the air between them with all its particular ugliness. "No," she said. Gerald opened the folder. He put a printed image on the desk. Security footage. Time-stamped. The quality variable, but functional. The loading dock camera, which she'd accounted for. The basement corridor camera, which she had also accounted for, because it only covered the first 20 feet of the corridor, and she'd learned its angle in the first week. But there was a third image, the service stairwell, the B2 landing, time-stamped 2:47 a.m., 11 days prior. The quality was bad. The angle was bad. The figure in it was half turned away from the camera, and the image was motion blurred. But the size was right. The coat was right. "That's not anyone I recognize," Zara said. "You've been working the service stairwell every night shift for 3 years." Gerald's voice had gone flat. "You know every face that uses those stairs. You know the camera positions." He tapped the photograph. "And you're telling me you didn't notice a man this size in the building?" "People use those stairs." "Not at 2:47 in the morning." She said nothing. Gerald closed the folder. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said, "because I think you're not stupid, even if you're making stupid choices." He set his hands on the desk. "Those men this morning work for people who do not lose gracefully. The man in that photograph, whoever he is, has made enemies that I do not want anywhere near this property. And if it turns out you were assisting him—" He let the sentence finish itself. Zara felt the weight of it, the full weight, not the suppressed version she'd been carrying since 5 in the morning. "Am I being terminated?" she said. Gerald looked at her for a long moment. "Not yet," he said, "but I'm watching you, every shift, every clock in and clock out, every inventory log." He stood, which meant the meeting was over. "Get back to work." She got back to work. She didn't go downstairs that night. She worked her shift to its end, took the bus home to the apartment with the eviction notice she still hadn't opened, made rice and canned beans on the 2-burner stove, sat at the small table by the window that looked out onto the street 3 floors below, and tried to think clearly about the situation she was in. The situation she was in was, she had lied to federal investigators. She had lied to her supervisor. She had provided shelter and food for 2 weeks, to a man she now understood was being hunted by people with institutional authority and significantly more resources than she had. She had done this for no strategic reason. She had done it because he was bleeding in an alley, and she couldn't walk past that. She could not walk past that. That was the thing about herself she had never quite figured out how to fix. She ate her rice and thought about his face when she'd held the bread out to him in the alley. The disbelief in it. The way he'd sealed it back up almost instantly, like a reflex. Like a man who'd trained himself to distrust anything offered without visible motive. She wondered where he was now, whether he'd made it through the east fire door, whether his ribs had held. She told herself to stop wondering. She went to bed. She was in the middle of a dream that was mostly Marcus's face and the sound of machinery when her phone went off at 1:40 in the morning. Unknown number. She stared at the screen. She answered. Silence for 3 seconds. Then, "The man from the parking structure is watching your building." Luca's voice. Rough, careful, low. Zara sat up and looked at the window. The street below was quiet. Cars parked on both sides. The corner bodega still lit. A delivery truck idling at the far end. Nothing obviously wrong. How do you know that? She said. The silver sedan. It's been there since 11. Driver's been out twice, both times to the corner and back, checking sightlines. He's not waiting for a delivery. She looked at the silver sedan. It was there. She hadn't noticed it before because she hadn't been looking for it. Where are you? She said. Doesn't matter. It matters to me. A pause. East side of the building across the street, 4th floor. There's a vacant unit above a pharmacy. You broke into an apartment. The lock was already broken. I didn't break it. That is... She stopped. That is such a specific distinction to make. Zara, his voice shifted. Something tightened in it. They're not just looking for me. They pulled your employment file this afternoon. I have a contact who... He stopped. I have someone who monitors that kind of query. They ran your record, your address, your brother's address in Detroit. The room got cold. Why would they run Marcus's address? She said. Because you helped me, which means you know things. And people who want to make someone cooperative very quickly find the most efficient way to do it. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed carefully. The rice sat heavy in her stomach. The window showed her the quiet street with its parked cars and its one idling sedan, and the silent, dark building across from it where a man with broken ribs was watching her window from a vacant apartment. What do I do? She said. Nothing tonight. Don't go to the window again. Don't turn on additional lights. Act like you're asleep. A pause. I'm going to handle the man in the sedan. Handle. Relocate him. Luca. I'm not going to hurt him. He's a contractor, not a principal. I'm going to give him a reason to report a different location. She pressed her fingers against her eyes. And tomorrow is more complicated. Tell me. A longer pause this time. She heard something in the background, a distant sound, urban and indistinct, that could have been traffic or could have been something else. The people looking for me, he said slowly. They're not federal. Not officially. The investigators this morning were private. They carry legitimate ID because they have legitimate consulting arrangements with federal agencies, but they're not operating on federal authority. He paused. They work for 3 men who were my partners, business partners, who took everything I had in 48 hours through a financial maneuver I did not see coming because I trusted the wrong people. Zara said nothing. They want me silent, he said, permanently silent. And the easiest way to get to me is through anyone I've shown any proximity to. You showed proximity to a lot of people before you ended up bleeding in an alley. Those people had resources, lawyers, security. He was quiet for a moment. You have a broken lock on your building's front entrance and a supervisor who's already looking for reasons. So what you're telling me, she said, is that by helping you, I put a target on myself and on my brother. Yes. And you're telling me this now. I'm telling you this now because tonight is the last window to do something about it before it gets significantly harder. He paused again. I need you to trust me. Zara laughed. Not the good kind. The compressed, exhausted kind that comes out when something would be funny if it weren't your life. You need me to trust you. I've been lying to federal investigators and my employer for 2 weeks for a man who won't tell me his last name. Moretti, he said. Silence. Luca Moretti, he repeated, like he was watching the word land from across a distance. She knew the name. She knew it now. The way it surfaced up through the general sediment of things she half-registered and never followed up on. The Tribune's business section, the television in the hotel lobby, the kitchen staff talking about the 14th floor situation 2 years ago when the whole thing had been investigated and the charges had somehow dissolved. The Kingmaker, she said. It came out flat. That's what they call me, he said. Yes. The man who bought the Wentworth corridor last spring. Among other things. The man whose company acquired the Eastfield district and displaced 400 families. A pause. That deal was... He stopped. That deal was structured by my former partners without my final approval. I've been aware of that since it happened. That's not a very satisfying answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. She stood up from the bed. She walked to the wall beside the window, not in front of it, beside it. and stood there in the dark of her apartment thinking about the sedan outside and Marcus's address on some private investigator's database and the eviction notice on her table that she still hadn't opened. "What's the plan?" she said. "In the morning, you don't go to the hotel." "I'll lose my job." "You're going to lose your job regardless. Gerald is building a case. By end of week, he has enough. I've been watching that building longer than I should have, and I know how that man operates." His voice was careful and direct and gave her no cushioning on any of it. "Don't go in. I'll have someone bring a vehicle to the north side of your street at 7. You get in it. You go to a location I'll send to this number. You'll be safe there while I take care of the rest." "While you take care of the rest," she repeated. "Of the 3 business partners who froze your assets and sent private investigators to my apartment building and added my brother's address to their files." "Yes." "What does taking care of that look like?" He didn't answer immediately. She could hear his breathing on the line, controlled even, the breathing of a man who had made whatever decision was in front of him and was past the part where it could be unmade. "It looks like what I should have done before they got the first move," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now." She stood against the wall in the dark for a long moment. The sedan was still there. The building across the street was quiet. Somewhere 3 blocks east, a siren cycled through its loop and faded. 7 in the morning, she said. "Yes. North side of the street. Black vehicle. My driver's name is Emil. He'll say the name of the hotel." She turned away from the window. She sat back on the edge of the bed. She was thinking about the first night in the alley, the bread in her hand, the pale blue lips, the gray eyes that had looked at her like she was a threat to be evaluated, the way he'd eaten the bread, the way he'd looked at the scarf around his hands. She was thinking about Marcus's address in someone else's file. "Luca," she said. "Yes. If I get in that car tomorrow, everything before this, the hotel, the basement, all of it, that was one thing. That was a stranger in an alley that I couldn't walk past." She kept her voice steady. "If I get in that car, it's a different thing. You understand that." A pause, longer than the others. "I understand that," he said. "And you're asking me anyway." "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm asking you anyway." She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep again until almost 5. At 6:45, she was dressed. At 6:50, she picked up the eviction notice from the table and opened it. 30 days. Which was 30 days more than she'd expected, given how far behind she was. She folded it back carefully and put it in her coat pocket next to her phone. At 6:58, she picked up the single bag she'd packed, not much because she didn't have much, and went to the door. She stood there for 10 seconds. Then she opened it and walked out into the corridor and down the 3 flights to the street. The black vehicle was already there. The driver's window came down and the man behind it, compact, 50s, with the careful eyes of someone who had been doing this specific job for a long time, looked at her and said, "Velvet Crown." Zara got in. The car pulled away from the curb and she watched her building recede through the rear window. The peeling paint on the entrance, the broken lock on the front door, the silver sedan still parked on the opposite side of the street, its driver apparently asleep, or apparently asleep. She couldn't tell which. She turned forward. She didn't look back again. She didn't know that behind her, at that exact moment, Gerald was standing in the Velvet Crown Hotel lobby in front of 12 members of staff, holding the personnel file with her name on it, and beginning the public termination that he'd been building toward for 3 weeks. The humiliation performed in front of witnesses because witnesses made it more efficient, more final, more clearly a message to anyone else who thought about stepping out of line. She didn't know that. What she knew was the car moving through the early Chicago morning, the city gray and cold outside the windows, the phone in her pocket with one unsaved number in its recent calls, and the feeling of standing at a threshold she had just crossed in one direction and could not cross back. The driver took the I-90 ramp north, and in the pocket of Zara Bennett's coat, next to the eviction notice and the phone, was the green wool scarf she'd taken from the basement corner that morning without quite deciding to, the safe house was not what she'd expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. Something stark, probably. Something that announced its function through deliberate austerity, bare walls and bolted doors, and the smell of institutional seriousness. What Emil pulled into instead was a three-story brownstone on a quiet residential block in the Andersonville neighborhood, the kind of street where people walked dogs at 7 in the morning and left newspapers on their front steps and maintained the pleasant fiction that Chicago was a city of normal lives normally lived. The brownstone had window boxes. The window boxes had dead winter plants in them, frost-killed stems still upright in the cold, but someone had put them there in the first place, which meant someone had been thinking about appearances. Emil parked in the narrow alley behind the building and said nothing. He got out first, scanned the alley in both directions with the unhurried professionalism of someone for whom scanning alleys was the same category of automatic behavior as checking mirrors while driving, then opened her door. Inside, warmth, the smell of coffee already made, and a woman Zara had never seen before standing at the kitchen counter with her arms crossed and her expression doing the particular careful work of withholding judgment while actively forming it. She was mid-40s, dark hair cut short and practical. Good clothes worn like a uniform, not for appearance but for function, the kind of wardrobe that said I need to move quickly and not be noticed doing it. There was a laptop open on the counter beside her, and a phone face up next to it, and the quality of attention she directed at Zara was the same quality Luca's attention had. That precise cataloging focus that she was starting to understand was a trait of people who operated in environments where misreading someone cost you. "Zara Bennett," the woman said. Not a question. "Yes." "Diane Kessler." She didn't offer a hand. "I work with Luca. Have for 11 years. She paused. "Sit down, there's coffee." Zara sat at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee and said, "Where is he?" Handling something, Diane turned back to the counter and the laptop. "He'll be here by 9. "What's he handling?" "The man in the sedan outside your building last night filed a location report at 6:15 this morning. Luca needed to intercept the response before it reached the principal." She said this with the flat efficiency of someone describing traffic conditions. "He's handling it." "You're very calm about this." Diane glanced at her sideways. "I've been managing Luca Moretti's operational problems for 11 years. Calm is a professional requirement." She turned back to the screen. "Drink your coffee." Zara drank her coffee. She sat in the warm kitchen of the brownstone with the window boxes of dead plants outside the frost-patterned glass, and the woman across the counter typing at a speed that suggested she was doing 6 things at once, and she thought about the eviction notice in her pocket, and Marcus, and the silver sedan, and the folder Gerald had been holding with her name on it, and the moment in the car when she'd watched her building get smaller through the rear window and made herself stop looking. At 8:47, the back door opened. Luca came in. He looked worse than he had in the basement, which was saying something, because the baseline in the basement had not been good. There was fresh bruising along his left jaw that hadn't been there last night. His coat was wet at the shoulders from the sleet that had started coming down around 7. He was holding his left side in a way that wasn't quite holding it, more like a constant low-level awareness of where the pain was, the body's own monitoring system flagging the location without being told to. He looked at Zara. She looked at him. "You came," he said. "You sound surprised." "I am, slightly." He moved to the counter and poured coffee and drank half of it standing up, the way a person drank something when the thing they needed was the heat and the caffeine, and they weren't particularly interested in the experience. Then he set the cup down and looked at Diane. Voss's response team intercepted the sedan report. They know it was falsified. Diane's typing stopped. "How fast?" she said. 2 hours, maybe less. They have someone inside the relay service I've been using." His jaw was tight. "Which means Harlan told them about the relay." Zara watched Diane absorb this. The absorption was visible in the slight stiffening of her posture, the way her eyes moved to the laptop screen and then back to Luca with something in them that she controlled before it fully formed. "Harlan," Diane said carefully. "Yes." "You're certain?" "The relay service has 4 people who know the routing protocol. 3 of them I built from scratch. Harlan I brought in from the outside 14 months ago because Voss recommended him, and I was—" He stopped. Something moved through his expression like weather through a clear sky. Fast, dark, gone. "I was not sufficiently skeptical of that recommendation. Diane turned to face him fully. Luca, if Harlan has been feeding them since he came in, then everything I've done in 14 months has a leak in it. Yes. His voice was flat. I'm aware. The Andersonville property is in Harlan's operational knowledge. Yes. He looked at her steadily, which means we have somewhere between 90 minutes and 2 hours before this location is compromised. Zara set down her coffee cup. The sound of it on the table was small and precise in the silence. Tell me what I need to do, she said. Both of them looked at her. To not be here when they arrive, she said. Tell me what I need to do. Luca looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite the calculating assessment she'd catalogued in the basement, but something adjacent to it. Something that carried more weight than assessment, more personal than calculation. There's a secondary location, he said, on the North Shore. It's outside Harlan's operational knowledge. I set it up before he joined, under a shell that he never had access to. He looked at Diane. Get the Ravenswood account and the North Shore keys. Diane went upstairs without a word. Luca turned to the window over the kitchen sink and looked out at the alley. The sleet had thickened. It hit the window in irregular bursts, the kind of wet winter precipitation that Chicago specialized in. Not quite snow, not quite rain, maximum discomfort for minimum drama. Zara watched him at the window, the set of his shoulders, the way he was carrying the information about Harlan, not dramatically, not with the visible processing of someone working through shock, but with the contained quality of a man absorbing a wound and deciding not to let it show because showing it would cost him something he couldn't afford right now. He was your friend, she said. Luca didn't turn from the window. He was an employee. That's not what I said. A pause. The sleet hit the glass. He was useful, Luca said. I trusted his competence. You trusted him. He turned from the window. His gray eyes found hers, and there was something raw in them for exactly the length of time it took him to decide there wasn't, and then it was gone. I trusted him, he said. Zara nodded. She didn't say anything else about it because there was nothing else to say. She'd spent enough time with people who'd been betrayed by the specific category of person they'd chosen to trust to know that language was mostly useless in that territory. What she did instead was stand up from the table and bring both their coffee cups to the sink and wash them. Not because the cups needed washing, but because doing something with her hands was the only rational response to a situation that otherwise offered nothing actionable. Luca watched her wash the cups. You don't have to do that, he said. I know. She dried them and set them on the rack. Diane came back down the stairs with a set of keys on a plain ring and a manila envelope that she set on the counter without opening. Her face had a quality to it now that Zara hadn't seen upstairs, a compression, like she'd gone upstairs with one understanding of the situation and come back down with a different one and was in the process of reconciling them. There's something else, Diane said. Luca looked at her. I checked the Harlan timeline against our operational log while I was up there. She put her hand flat on the manila envelope. The Wentworth Corridor acquisition, the Eastfield displacement. She paused. Harlan was the point contact on both of those deals. Zara went very still. Luca's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A subtle tectonic shift, like bedrock moving. Those deals were Voss's architecture, he said slowly. They were run through Voss's division, yes. But Harlan was the operational liaison, the documentation routing, the legal structure, the timeline compression. Those were Harlan's work. Diane's voice was careful and even. Luca, those deals were structured to go through before your final review window. The timing on both of them was not accidental, he said. No. The kitchen was very quiet. Zara thought about the 400 families in Eastfield. She thought about what Luca had said on the phone. That deal was structured by my former partners without my final approval. She'd heard it last night as a justification, the kind of retroactive distancing that powerful people did when the consequences of their empire's operations became inconvenient to own. She heard it differently now. She didn't know how to feel about that. The feeling was complicated, and she put it somewhere she could examine it later. We need to move, Luca said. They moved. Emile had a second vehicle in the alley. Different plates, different profile. a gray mid-range sedan that looked like it belonged to someone who worked in insurance. The three of them went out the back and into the vehicle in under 2 minutes. Diane had the laptop. Luca had the manila envelope. Zara had her bag and her coat and the eviction notice and the green scarf and the particular feeling of a person who has made one significant decision and is now being carried by its momentum through a sequence of subsequent decisions that they didn't entirely choose. They were 4 blocks from the brownstone when the black SUVs appeared. 2 of them, coming from the north, moving fast through the sleet-wet streets with the coordinated purpose of vehicles that knew exactly where they were going. Emil saw them first. His posture changed slightly, a micro-adjustment, and his eyes went to the rear view with a calculation happening in them. "North approach," he said. "Don't stop," Luca said. Emil didn't stop. He took the next left without signaling, and the SUVs continued north on the main road, and the gray sedan moved through the residential grid of Andersonville at a speed that was fast enough to be purposeful and slow enough not to announce itself, and Zara sat in the back seat beside Luca and watched the street and breathed. "They'll find the brownstone empty," Luca said. He was looking straight ahead. "And then what?" she said. "And then Voss knows I know about the relay, and Harlan knows he's burned." He paused. "Which changes the board." "How?" "Harlan panics when he's burned. He has a documented history of it. I've seen it twice before in smaller situations. He'll contact Voss directly instead of through the protocol, which means he'll use a channel I can monitor." He looked at her briefly. "It gives me a window." "To do what?" "To pull everything Harlan touched in 14 months and find out exactly how deep this goes." Diane, in the front seat, said without turning, "You should tell her the rest." Luca was quiet. "Tell me the rest," Zara said. Another pause. The sedan moved south through streets she didn't recognize, the city's grid reshuffling itself around her the way it did when you left the neighborhoods you knew. "The 3 principals," Luca said. "Voss, Carver, and Stellan. When they moved against me 5 years ago, when they froze the accounts and bribed the allies and put the men in the alley, I thought it was about the money, about control of the acquisition portfolio." He looked out the window. "It wasn't just that." "What was it?" "There's a federal investigation, has been for 3 years, an ongoing grand jury proceeding looking at financial structures used to acquire and redevelop urban properties across the Midwest. The kind of investigation that, if it reaches the right documents, implicates people in things that go well beyond aggressive real estate practices." He paused. "Voss, Carver, and Stellan are in those documents, substantially. And you." He turned to look at her fully. "My name is in the documents. I was a partner. I signed things that I would not have signed if I'd understood what I was signing." He held her gaze. "That is not an excuse. It is a fact about what I knew and when I knew it." Zara looked at him. "The reason they wanted me silent 5 years ago," he said, "was that I'd started asking questions about the Eastfield deal specifically. I was getting close to understanding what they'd been using the acquisition structures for underneath the real estate transactions, and a live Luca Moretti asking questions was a liability they couldn't manage." He looked back at the window. "A dead Luca Moretti was a solution. But they didn't kill you. They tried. The alley behind the Velvet Crown was not the first attempt." He was quiet for a moment. "It was the most effective. I was in genuinely bad shape by that point. 3 days with almost no resources, 2 prior encounters that had depleted things significantly." She thought about the pale blue lips, the dried blood on the coat sleeve, the way he'd eaten the bread. "What's underneath the real estate transactions?" she said. Diane turned halfway in the front seat. Her face was doing the withholding judgment work again, but with a different quality to it now. Not assessing Zara, but assessing the conversation, deciding something. "Labor trafficking," Diane said. "Construction and service contracts used to move people. The acquisition structures created a legal architecture that obscured money flows from Eastern European and Southeast Asian networks. The properties were the machine. The construction and renovation projects were the pipeline." The sedan moved through an intersection. The sleet had turned to something closer to actual snow, the flakes large and wet, smearing across the windshield between wiper strokes. Zara sat with this. She sat with it the way you sat with something that was too heavy to pick up all at once, getting the weight of one end first, then the other, establishing the full dimensions before you tried to move it. The hotel, she said. The Velvet Crown is owned by a holding company, Luca said. The holding company has 6 layers of corporate structure between it and any identifiable principal. 3 of those layers were architected by the same legal team that built the Eastfield acquisition structure. She thought about Gerald, about the 14th floor situation 2 years ago that had been investigated and somehow resolved, about the private investigators with their legitimate-looking federal credentials, about the men in the basement corridor with their flashlights sweeping in practiced patterns. I worked in that building for 3 years, she said. I know. My paycheck came from a subsidiary 3 levels above the direct holding company. Your direct employer is a hospitality management group that is operationally legitimate. They manage the property. They don't own it, and they don't know who does. She looked at the side of his face. He was looking straight ahead. You've known this since when? She said. Since approximately 14 months into the rebuild, when I started pulling the ownership structures systematically. He paused. Since before I knew you were working there. But you knew I was working there. I knew after I started rebuilding. I had Diane locate you. I needed to know you were... He stopped, rephrased. I wanted to know you were all right. Zara looked at him. You had someone locate me, she said slowly. You knew where I was working. You knew what the building's ownership structure was connected to. She kept her voice very even. And you said nothing. The silence in the sedan had a different quality now. I was building a case, he said. Surfacing the information prematurely would have... I worked in that building for 3 years. Her voice was still even. The evenness was costing her something. My paycheck, my health insurance, what I had of it. My entire livelihood for 3 years was running through a structure connected to the people who were running trafficking operations through acquisition vehicles. She breathed. And you knew. It's not. Don't tell me it's not what it looks like. Tell me what it is. He turned to face her. His jaw was tight. His gray eyes had the flatness that came over them when he was working through something he didn't want to work through. I was protecting the investigation, he said. If I told you, if you'd done anything differently, the people watching that building would have had confirmation that I had contact with you. They were already watching the building because of the ownership connection. Any deviation in your behavior, I was already deviating. I had you in the basement for 2 weeks, which they suspected but couldn't confirm, which is why they sent private contractors instead of moving directly. He held her gaze. If you had walked out of that building with knowledge of what it was connected to, they would have had you in an interrogation room inside 6 hours. Not federal, not procedural. The kind where the people asking questions aren't interested in your rights. Zara pressed her back against the car seat and looked at the ceiling of the sedan. She was thinking about 3 years. The weight of 3 years spent in a building that was part of something she'd never consented to know about. $12 an hour generated for an ownership structure that was laundering money for people who moved human beings like cargo. She was thinking about how tired she'd been in that building, how relentlessly, structurally tired, not just her body, but something deeper, some layer of herself that the job had been extracting without her understanding the mechanism. She was also thinking that what Luca had said about the risk was not wrong. She knew enough about the private investigators and the men with flashlights to understand that the danger he was describing was real. She could hold both things simultaneously, that his reasoning had been sound and that the result of it was that she had spent 3 years in ignorance of something that deeply implicated her life. Both things were true. Neither of them resolved into something simple. We're 20 minutes out, Emil said from the front. Quiet, calibrated, giving them the information and nothing else. Zara sat up. The federal investigation, she said. The grand jury. It's still active. Yes. What does it need? Luca looked at her carefully. Documentation, he said. Financial records that establish the connection between the acquisition structures and the trafficking operations directly. The corporate layering is sophisticated. There are gaps that witness testimony alone can't bridge. He paused. And a witness who can speak to the operational structure from inside it. You. Partially. My knowledge of the financial architecture is documented, but I was kept at a distance from the operational side deliberately. Voss understood that I would have exited the partnership immediately if I'd known the full scope. So my testimony addresses the financial fraud components, but not the operational trafficking structure directly. Then who? Diane turned from the front seat. Harlan, she said. Harlan Briggs has operational knowledge of both sides. He was Voss's man inside Luca's organization, which means he was positioned to know what Luca knew about the finances and what Voss's network was doing operationally. She held Zara's gaze. He's the bridge witness. But he's working for them, Zara said. He's working for them because they have something on him, Luca said. Harlan made choices early in his career that Voss documented and has been using as leverage for at least the last 2 years. Remove the leverage, and he flips, Zara said. If the alternative is federal charges in a trafficking case versus cooperation with an existing grand jury proceeding, yes, he flips. The sedan slowed as Emil navigated a turn onto a narrower road. The snow was coming down in earnest now, the city's infrastructure slipping into the muffled, reduced contrast world that heavy snow produced. Sounds softened, distances compressed. Zara thought about all of it, the full topology of it, the years-long shape of a thing that had been happening around and underneath her life without her knowledge. The men in the basement corridor and the photograph on the hotel security footage and the eviction notice and Marcus's address in a private investigator's database. She thought about Gerald performing her termination in the hotel lobby that morning. She didn't know it had happened yet, but she would learn later that it had, in front of 12 witnesses, her belongings in a cardboard box on the front sidewalk in the sleet, Gerald with the flat satisfaction of a man who had finally finished something. The North Shore property was a modest 2-story house set back from a dead-end street, surrounded by the kind of dormant winter trees that would be dense cover in summer, and were merely skeleton cover now. Emil pulled into the garage and killed the engine, and the garage door came down behind them. Inside, the house was cold, unoccupied cold, the particular chill of a space that had been sealed for a while. Diane found the thermostat. Luca went to the main room and opened the manila envelope on the coffee table, spreading documents across it with the focused economy of a man whose mind had moved past the conversation in the car and into the next problem. Zara stood in the doorway between the hall and the main room and watched him. She'd been watching him for weeks now, and she understood the grammar of him fairly well by this point. The tells that other people probably missed because they were buried under the general severity of his presentation, the minute differentials in expression that meant something when you'd cataloged enough of them. The tension in his shoulders right now was not operational tension. It was the particular tension of a man who had said things he hadn't planned to say and wasn't certain what they'd cost him. "Luca," she said. He looked up from the documents. "The green wool scarf," she said. "From the basement." He waited. "I took it back this morning." She met his eyes. "From your corner. You put it back on the shelf 2 weeks ago, and I took it back this morning." She paused. "I don't know exactly why I'm telling you that." He looked at her for a moment. "I do," he said quietly. Something in the room shifted. Not dramatically, not with any of the machinery of obvious emotional transaction, just a small change in the atmospheric pressure of two people standing in a cold house in the middle of something that had been building for longer than either of them had acknowledged. Then Diane walked in from the kitchen and said, "Harlan made contact. He used the unsecured channel, like you said he would." She looked at Luca with her phone in her hand. "He's not calling Voss." Luca straightened. "Who's he calling?" he said. Diane's expression did something then that Zara hadn't seen it do yet in the hours she'd been watching it. Something that bypassed the professional withholding and landed in a territory that looked almost like fear. "He's calling the federal case agent," Diane said. "He's already talking. He's been talking for 20 minutes. She held up the phone. "Luca, he's not flipping because we burned him. He was already flipped. He's been working with the federal investigation for—" She looked at the screen. The timestamp on the initial cooperation agreement. Luca took the phone. He looked at the screen. His face went through something that Zara watched with the full attention she'd been developing for weeks. The rapid sequence of understanding, then recalculation, then the thing underneath both of them that was older and deeper and did not have a professional name. 8 months, he said. Yes. Harlan has been cooperating with the federal case for 8 months. Yes. Which means the relay compromise, the location report this morning, those were not Harlan feeding information to Voss. He set the phone down on the coffee table with a precision that was the opposite of the violence it contained. Harlan was feeding information to the federal case team. The location report, the sedan outside Zara's building, the brownstone address. He looked up. They weren't trying to find me for Voss. No, Diane said. They were building the chain of custody for the federal case, documenting my location, my associates, my... He stopped. He looked at Zara. Zara looked at him. My contact with a witness, he said. The silence in the cold room was complete. What does that mean? Zara said. It means, Luca said slowly, that the federal case team has 8 months of documentation showing Harlan's cooperation. It means they have the financial records he provided. It means they are... He stopped again, ran the calculation. They're close. They're very close to having enough, which is why Voss moved this week specifically. He looked at Diane. Voss knows Harlan flipped. That's what the accelerated timeline is about. He's not trying to silence me because of what I know. He's trying to burn the case before the grand jury can act. Destroy the witness chain, destroy the documentation, make enough noise that the case falls apart on evidentiary grounds. And if he burns it, Diane said, then he walks. Luca's voice was flat. Everything. The financial fraud, the acquisition structures, the trafficking operations, all of it walks because the evidentiary chain is broken. Zara sat down. She sat down on the edge of the armchair near the door because her legs decided they'd done enough for the moment and the chair was there. She thought about 400 families in Eastfield. She thought about the people moved through construction pipelines and the acquisition structures. She thought about $12 an hour and a paycheck and 3 years of not knowing. What does the federal case team need right now, she said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady. Luca looked at her with an expression that had moved past calculation and past the careful professional distance and was simply direct. Honest in the specific way that people were honest when the situation had stripped away the management of it. They need the documentation I've been building for 5 years, he said. The financial architecture, the corporate layering, the acquisition timeline mapped against the trafficking operations. He paused. And they need it delivered in a way that can't be burned. Not a server, not a relay. Physical documentation, chain of custody established through personal testimony, delivered directly to the case agent with Harlan's cooperation agreement as the corroborating... His phone went off. He looked at the screen. The color left his face in a way that Zara had not seen before. Not the controlled blanking of a man managing his expression, but the real thing. The involuntary. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. It was a photograph. Marcus Bennett, her brother. Standing outside a physical therapy clinic in Detroit that she recognized from the photographs he sent her, sir, the blue awning, the accessible ramp, the parking lot with the chain-link fence at the back. Standing beside him, 2 men she didn't recognize. Close. Too close. The body language of proximity that was not casual. Below the photograph, a text from a number she didn't recognize. Deliver Moretti to the following address within 4 hours, or your brother learns the difference between a warning and a consequence. Zara took the phone from Luca's hand. She looked at the photograph. She looked at it for a long time. Then she stood up from the chair and walked to the window and stood there looking out at the dormant winter trees and the snow coming down through. She stood at the window for 11 seconds. Zara counted them. Not deliberately. Her brain was doing the counting automatically the way it ran numbers in the morning, the way it tracked things that couldn't be changed. And what it was counting now was the distance between the person she'd been 3 hours ago and the person standing at this window, holding a phone with her brother's photograph on it. 11 seconds. Then she turned around. I need to call him, she said. That's what they want, Luca said. He was on his feet watching her with the full operational attention, but there was something underneath it now. A tightness around his eyes that she recognized as the specific quality of a man who understood that he had caused this and was not going to look away from that. I know what they want. Her voice came out even. She was faintly surprised by that. I'm not calling him to negotiate. I'm calling him to tell him to move. Luca looked at her for 1 second, then he nodded. She called Marcus. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was awake and near his phone, which meant the men in the photograph had not yet moved from proximity to something worse. Zara, don't talk. Listen. She turned back to the window. The snow was still coming down through the winter trees. There are 2 men near you right now. I don't know exactly where you are. I just left the clinic. I'm at the bus stop on... Don't say where you are. Are the men still with you? A pause. She could hear his breathing, the slightly effortful quality of it that had been there since the warehouse accident, the permanent reminder of what a broken rib healed wrong did to your lung capacity. There's a car, he said slowly. It's been behind me since the clinic. I thought it was just... It's not. Marcus, I need you to go somewhere public. A store, a restaurant, anywhere with people and cameras, right now, without running. Just walk directly into it. Do not go home. Zara, what? I will explain everything. Walk now. Talk later. She heard the sound of his footsteps changing, the rhythm of a man shifting from a casual pace to something purposeful without breaking into the panic that would announce itself. There's a pharmacy on the corner, he said quietly. Go in. Stay in. I'll call you back in 20 minutes. She hung up. She turned to find Luca already at the coffee table, the documents spread in front of him, Diane on the phone in the kitchen doorway, speaking in a low, fast voice that had the clipped cadence of someone issuing instructions they'd issued before. Voss's people in Detroit, Luca said without looking up from the documents. How many and what level? The photograph was taken within the last hour, Zara said. 2 men visible. The car Marcus mentioned. That's at least 3. Contractors, Luca said. Same network as the sedan outside your building. Not principals, not Voss's core team. He was pulling specific documents from the spread on the table, which means they're on a timer. They have a window to execute the leverage play, and if I don't deliver to whatever address is in that text within 4 hours, they escalate. Then we have 4 hours. We have less than 4 hours because Voss will recalibrate the moment he understands we're not responding to the demand in the expected way. He looked up at her. He'll know within 90 minutes that I'm not walking into that address. At that point, the Detroit contractors stop being leverage and become punishment. Zara absorbed this. The absorption was physical. She felt it in her chest, in the specific tightening that came with threat that wasn't abstract. What do we do? She said. We do what I should have done 8 months ago when Harlan first made contact with the federal case. He held up a specific document, dense columns of financial data, corporate identifiers, account routing numbers. We deliver this, all of it, directly and immediately, not through the controlled handoff I was planning, not through a scheduled evidentiary submission. We push it now, we push it hard, and we do it in a way that takes Voss's ability to burn the case off the table before he can act. The case agent, Diane said from the doorway. I have Harlan's contact number for the federal team. If Harlan is actively cooperating, he'll broker the emergency submission, Luca said. He was stacking documents with a focus that was total and unnerving, the focus of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment for 5 years and was not going to fumble it now that it was here. Diane, get Harlan on the phone. Tell him we need a direct channel to the case agent in the next 30 minutes. Tell him Voss moved on the witness family. That changes the federal team's timeline. They'll want to act before Voss burns more evidence. Diane was already dialing. Luca looked at Zara. There's something else, he said. She waited. The submission alone isn't enough to protect Marcus right now. The federal case takes hours, days to produce injunctive protection for associated witnesses. The contractors in Detroit don't operate on legal timelines. He held her gaze. I have to go to Detroit. You have broken ribs and a federal asset seizure on your accounts, and I have Emil and 2 other people I trust who are currently in this metropolitan area and can be on I-94 in 20 minutes. He was already reaching for his coat. The contractors are following a script. Their script says wait for Moretti to respond to the leverage demand. If I show up in Detroit personally before Voss knows I'm not complying, you're changing the script before they can escalate. Yes. She looked at him. I'm coming, she said. Zara, he's my brother. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. And you have broken ribs, and I have been watching your left side every time you stand up from a chair, and I know exactly how much that injury is limiting your range, and you know I'm right." She picked up her bag from the floor. "I'm coming." He looked at her for 3 full seconds. "Fine," he said. Emil was already in the garage. Luca made 2 calls in the time it took them to get from the main room to the vehicle. Brief, specific, the kind of calls where both parties knew exactly what was being communicated and no words were wasted confirming it. By the time they were on I-94 heading east toward Detroit, Diane had Harlan Briggs on the phone from the house and was conducting what Zara gathered from the fragments she could hear on the speaker through the partition was a conversation that Harlan had been waiting for and dreading simultaneously. The drive to Detroit was 4 hours in normal conditions. Emil drove it in 3 hours and 12 minutes in heavy snow by a method that Zara decided not to examine too closely, because examining it would have required her to think about things other than the problem in front of her, and the problem in front of her required all of her. Luca spent the drive on the phone and not on the phone in roughly equal measure. She sat beside him in the back seat and watched the interstate move under them and felt the particular quality of time that happened when things were compressing. When the distance between the current moment and the moment when something broke open irreversibly was closing faster than the mind could fully track. 40 minutes out from Detroit, his phone went off. He looked at the screen. Something changed in his face. "Voss knows," he said. "How?" "One of the 3 people I called in the last 2 hours. He said it with a flatness that contained everything it contained. "I have a leak I haven't identified yet." "Does he know where we're going?" "He will shortly." Emil's eyes went to the rear view. "We have a tail," Emil said. Not alarmed. Factual. Zara turned. 2 vehicles back, a dark blue SUV maintaining consistent spacing despite the traffic variations that should have changed it. She'd been paying attention to the road and hadn't seen it attach, which meant it had been with them for a while. "Since when?" Luca said. "Merged from the Portage on-ramp, 48 minutes ago." "1 vehicle." "So far." Luca looked at his phone. He was doing the calculation. She could see him doing it, the rapid assessment of variables that he carried out with the same focused economy he applied to everything. 1 tail meant surveillance or coordination. 2 vehicles meant an intercept. He made a call. The call lasted 45 seconds. She heard 2 words clearly on the other end, the case agent's name and then an address, before Luca said 30 minutes and ended it. "Harlan's federal contact is meeting us at Marcus's location," he said. "The case team is activating an emergency protective measure for associated witnesses pending the evidence submission." He looked at her. "Marcus is safe from the legal side in approximately 45 minutes. And the men already on the ground with him. That's the 30 minutes. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Zara's life, and she had had some long ones. They came off the interstate and into Detroit's east side with the dark blue SUV still 2 vehicles back and the snow coming down in the same committed way it had been coming down all day. And Emil navigated the city grid with the calm efficiency of a man who had studied the relevant maps in advance because that was the kind of professional he was. Zara had Marcus on the phone. He was still in the pharmacy, had been in the pharmacy for 2 hours, had made 2 purchases to avoid the staff asking him to leave, and was currently standing near the cold medicine aisle watching the street through the front window. "There's a second car now," Marcus said. "Black. It's been circling the block." "How many times?" 3 that I've seen." "Don't move. We're 12 minutes out." "Zara, what is happening?" She looked at Luca. "Someone tried to use you to get to me," she said. "We're fixing it." A pause. "We." "Me and a person I know." "What kind of person?" She looked at Luca again. He was looking at the street through the window, his jaw set, his left hand resting on his knee with a steadiness that she understood was deliberate. The hand wanted to go to his ribs, and he wasn't letting it. "The complicated kind," she said. They came around the corner onto Marcus's street, and the situation rearranged itself in approximately 4 seconds. The black car that had been circling was parked. The 2 men from the photograph were on the sidewalk, and a 3rd man, one she hadn't seen before, bigger than the other two, with the particular physical confidence of someone who'd been doing field work for a long time, was walking toward the pharmacy entrance. "Emil," Luca said, "I see it." The sedan pulled to the curb 30 feet from the pharmacy entrance. Luca was out of the car before it fully stopped. Zara was out half a second behind him, which was not the plan, and she was aware it was not the plan, and she did it anyway because the big man was 6 steps from the pharmacy door and Marcus was on the other side of it. What happened in the next 90 seconds was something she would reconstruct later in pieces, because at the time she was operating on the pure functional clarity that extreme threat produced. Not adrenaline exactly, not the way movies depicted it, but a narrowing of everything down to the specific geometry of the problem and what her body was capable of doing about it. Luca moved directly into the big man's path. He did it with no announcement and no hesitation, planting himself between the man and the pharmacy door with the physical authority of someone who had decided that this specific ground was not going to be ceded, and the man stopped. The stop was involuntary. The body's automatic response to something in Luca's bearing that communicated, at a frequency below language, that moving forward was going to be significantly more expensive than it had appeared from a distance. The two men from the photograph were moving now, coming off the parked car, closing the distance from behind. Zara put herself between them and Luca's back. She didn't think about it. She was there. The man on the left stopped. He looked at her, a genuine look, the kind that recalibrates, because she was a woman in a winter coat standing in the snow between him and his objective, and the specific quality of her stillness was not what he'd been expecting. "Step aside," he said. "No," she said. The big man in front of Luca said something low. She didn't catch it, the wind was wrong, but she saw Luca's response to it, which was a very small and very cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're 2 minutes from this becoming federal obstruction," Luca said. His voice carried across the snow with a clarity that cut through the wind. "Your principal's cooperation agreement has already been revoked. Your contracts are void. And the case agents who are going to be standing on this street in approximately 90 seconds are going to want to know whether you'd like to be on the right side of what happens next or the wrong one." The big man's expression moved through something. Voss said, "Voss is finishing," Luca said. "You need to decide right now whether you're finishing with him." The pharmacy door opened. Marcus Bennett came out. He was 31 years old and moved with the particular careful economy of someone managing permanent physical limitation with dignity, his left side compensating for the lung capacity that would never fully come back. He was shorter than Zara by 2 inches and looked enough like her that the family resemblance was immediate and unmistakable. He saw Zara and his face did the thing faces did when relief and terror arrived simultaneously and couldn't decide which one to lead with. He also saw the men. He saw Luca. He took in the full geometry of the scene on the sidewalk with the rapid assessment of someone who had learned, the hard way, that situations deteriorated fast if you didn't understand them quickly. He looked at Zara. "You okay?" he said. "Fine," she said. "You sure?" "Working on it." The big man in front of Luca hadn't moved. His eyes were doing something, calculating, assessing, running the numbers on the Voss equation and what it looked like right now versus what it had looked like this morning. The two men behind Zara had also not moved. The situation was in the specific suspended state of a thing that had not yet broken in either direction. Then 2 vehicles turned onto the block from the north end. Not SUVs, sedans, government plates, the understated profile of vehicles that didn't need to announce themselves because everyone who needed to know what they were already knew. The big man looked at the sedans, then at Luca. He stepped back. 1 step, then 2. The sidewalk geometry opened up. The sedans pulled to the curb. 3 people got out. 2 men and a woman, all with the same alert professional bearing, the woman slightly ahead of the men with the authority of someone who was running the situation and not managing it. She had a badge out before she reached the sidewalk. "Case Agent Renata Vega," she said to no one specifically, and everyone present. Everybody stays exactly where they are. The big man and the 2 contractors complied with the specific tired resignation of people who had known, somewhere in the part of themselves they didn't consult, that this was where the road was going. Vega looked at Luca. Moretti, she said. Agent Vega, he said, you want to tell me why I'm standing in Detroit instead of accepting a scheduled evidence submission in Chicago? Because your timeline accelerated when Voss moved on the witness family set, he said. And because I have 38 months of financial documentation in that vehicle that you need before Voss's legal team files for an emergency injunction on the corporate records in the next. He checked his watch. 4 hours. Vega looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been building a federal case for 3 years and was now standing in the snow outside a Detroit pharmacy having the most important conversation of that case and was deciding whether to lead with the procedural objection or skip straight to the part where she got what she needed. She skipped straight to the part. Get it out of the vehicle, she said. Luca turned to Emil. Emil was already opening the trunk. The next 40 minutes were procedure. The particular, dense, specific procedure of federal evidence intake, chain of custody establishment, the documentation of witnesses and circumstances that turned raw information into legally actionable material. Zara stood with Marcus on the sidewalk outside the pharmacy while it happened, her brother's arm against hers, both of them watching the federal agents work through the documentation that Luca and Emil brought out from the trunk in organized sections. Marcus didn't say much. He watched the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who understood they were adjacent to something significant without knowing its full shape. After a while, he said, "The complicated person." Zara looked at him. He was watching Luca, who was standing at the open trunk of the sedan with Agent Vega, working through documents, answering her rapid-fire questions with the focused directness of a man who had been preparing for this specific conversation for years and was not going to waste a single second of it. "Yes," she said. "He got you mixed up in something." "I got myself mixed up in something," she said. "Approximately 5 weeks ago, in an alley." Marcus turned to look at her. She looked back at him. "You fed him," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. He knew her, knew exactly how a story that started with her in an alley and ended here would have begun. "I fed him," she said. Her brother looked back at Luca for a moment. Then he made the quiet sound he made when he was filing something away. A low exhale, the sound of acceptance without full understanding. "He okay?" Marcus said. Zara watched Luca at the trunk, the way he was favoring his left side with that same careful, constant awareness, the injury visible in small ways to anyone who was looking for it. The way he was answering Vega's questions with total focus, despite 3 hours of driving in the aftermath of a morning that had included, at minimum, a compromised safe house and a street confrontation, and the full weight of a betrayal he'd identified and absorbed and moved past in the span of a single car ride. "He's managed worse," she said. She believed it. She wasn't entirely sure what that said about either of them. It was past 2 in the afternoon when Agent Vega finally looked up from the documentation and said something to Luca in a lower voice, private, the volume dropping below what the ambient street noise would carry. Luca listened. His head moved slightly. Not a nod exactly, more the micro-adjustment of someone integrating new information. Then he turned and looked at Zara across the 12 feet of snowy sidewalk between them. She looked back. His expression had the quality of a man standing at the end of something long, not triumphant, not relieved, not any of the states she might have expected, but present, stripped down to something under the severity and the calculation and the years of building toward this specific moment, present in the way people were present when they'd run out of things to manage, and all that was left was what was actually there. He walked over to where she was standing with Marcus. "Voss," he said. "His legal team filed the injunction 30 minutes ago. Vega's team has already responded. The evidence submission predates the filing by 19 minutes. The injunction fails." He paused. "It's going to hold." She absorbed this. "Marcus is under federal witness protection protocol, effective immediately," he said. "His address and information are being scrubbed from Voss's contractor database. There'll be an agent on his building for the next 72 hours while the grand jury moves." Marcus looked at Luca. Luca looked back at him. "I'm sorry," Luca said. "For the position you were put in." Marcus studied him for a moment with the unhurried assessment of a man who had learned not to spend his limited physical energy on unnecessary things and was therefore very deliberate about where he directed his attention. "Zara tell you about the warehouse?" Marcus said. "Yes." "Eastfield," Marcus said. "My buddy Ray had a place there. 4-room apartment, 3 kids. You know what they paid him in relocation assistance?" He looked at Luca steadily. $800. Luca held his gaze. "I know." "You know," Marcus repeated. Not hostile, just precise. "I know it doesn't cover what was done. I know the explanation for how it happened doesn't undo it." He paused. "I'm going to try to." Marcus looked at him for another long moment. Then he looked at Zara. She gave him nothing, no sign, no signal, because it wasn't her accounting to influence. This was her brother's ledger, and he was going to balance it the way he balanced everything, slowly, carefully, and with more fairness than the situation probably required. Marcus looked back at Luca. "You got a long way to go," he said. "Yes," Luca said. "I do." It was the right answer. She could see Marcus absorb it and file it in the category of things that were not finished but were at least honest. Agent Vega came off her phone and walked toward them with the brisk purposefulness of someone whose afternoon had just gotten significantly more complicated. "Moretti," she said, "we need to move the documentation to the field office. I need you in Chicago by 6 for a preliminary deposition." She looked at Zara. "You're Zara Bennett." "Yes." "You're on my witness list." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said everything. "I'll need a statement before end of day." "Okay," Zara said. "The Velvet Crown's ownership structure is part of our documentation. Your employment there, the timeline, your direct knowledge of hotel operations, that's material." Vega held her gaze. "You understand what that means. It means I'm testifying in a federal case. It means you're central to one," Vega said. "There's a difference." She looked between them. "We'll need to move. Voss's attorneys are going to start filing everything they have in the next 2 hours, and I want all of this locked in before they get any traction." She walked back toward her agents. Zara stood in the snow outside the Detroit pharmacy, with her brother on her left and Luca on her right, and the case agent's words sitting in the cold air around her. Central. She thought about the alley, the bread, the pale blue lips and the gray eyes, and the question he'd asked, "Why are you helping me?" And the answer she'd given, which had been true and simple and had not contained even the faintest foreshadowing of this specific moment on this specific sidewalk. She thought about 3 years at the Velvet Crown, about Gerald's voice and the cardboard box and the eviction notice in her pocket. She thought about 400 families in Eastfield and a warehouse accident and $800 in relocation assistance. She put her hand in her coat pocket and touched the green wool scarf without taking it out. Luca looked at her. She looked at him. "Chicago," she said. "Chicago," he said. They walked to the vehicles. The snow had not stopped. The sky was the flat white of a city in deep winter, the light sourceless and even, the kind of day that gave nothing back. Emil had the sedan running, heat already going, and Marcus had a federal escort and a phone with Zara's number saved under call first, and the particular expression of a man who had absorbed an extraordinary afternoon and was reserving full judgment for when he had more information. Zara got in the back seat. Luca got in beside her. Emil pulled away from the curb, and the pharmacy receded, and Detroit receded, and the interstate ramp came up, and the sedan moved east through the white afternoon toward Chicago at a pace that meant they'd make it by 6 if the roads held. 40 minutes in, somewhere between the Michigan state line and the Indiana toll road, Luca said quietly. "How are you?" She thought about it honestly. "Functional," she said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she said. "It's not." He was quiet. She looked out the window at the flat white landscape moving past, the winter fields, the overpass structures, the particular American monotony of interstate driving in bad weather that she'd always found in small doses almost meditative. "When it's over," she said, "when the case is done and the deposition is given and whatever happens next has happened." She paused. "What does that look like?" He didn't answer immediately. She'd learned that his silences were not evasions. They were the time he needed to say the true thing instead of the functional thing, and she'd learned to give them space. "I don't know," he said. "Completely. Partially." He looked at her. The gray eyes had the quality she'd been cataloging for weeks. The assessment underneath the assessment, the layer below the layer. But there was something else in them now that she couldn't categorize as cleanly as the rest. "The Hawthorne District," he said, "in Chicago. I've been acquiring it block by block for 3 years. Under a structure that—" He stopped. "I'll tell you the full structure later. But the short version is that it was built to be transferred. The ownership, the governance, the operational decision-making." He held her gaze. "I built it to be transferred to someone who wouldn't use it the way I've used things." Zara looked at him. "The motive question," he said, "that you asked me in the car this morning, about knowing where you worked and saying nothing." He looked away briefly at the road ahead. "It wasn't only about protecting the investigation." He paused. "It was also that I didn't know how to approach what I owed you without it looking like exactly what it looks like. A powerful man writing a check for a debt he can't actually pay." "What do you owe me?" she said. "My life," he said. Simply. Without drama. "I was going to die in that alley. Whatever I've built since then, good and bad, the case and the Eastfield disaster, and everything between, it exists because you knelt in the snow and gave me bread." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know how to account for that in any currency that makes sense." She looked at him. The sedan moved through the Indiana toll plaza, the attendant's booth a bright island in the gray afternoon, gone in a second. She said, "You don't owe me a district." "I know." "You don't owe me anything that can be measured in property." "I know that too." "Then what are you trying to say?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm trying to say that I built something," he said, "and I built it thinking about you, not as a debt, as a direction." He paused. As the only direction that made sense after the alley. The sedan moved, the snow moved, outside Chicago, with the skyline beginning to materialize through the gray distance. The familiar silhouette, the lake behind it, the city that was about to become the site of something that would not be undone. Luca's phone went off. He looked at the screen, his face changed. "What?" she said. He turned the phone. The text was from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. "Voss knows about Harlan," and below it, 3 seconds later, a second text from the same number. "He's not running. He's coming." Emil had the accelerator down before Luca finished reading the second text. The sedan pushed past 90 on the Indiana stretch of I-90, and the snow came at the windshield in long horizontal streaks, and Zara sat with the phone in her hand, reading the 4 words again. "He's not running. He's coming," and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "Who sent this?" she said. "Carver," Luca said. He was already dialing. "The third principal. He and Voss have been partners for 15 years, but Carver has always been the one who understood when a position was untenable." He put the phone to his ear. "He's telling me Voss has gone kinetic." Meaning Voss has stopped trying to burn the case through legal channels and started trying to burn the witnesses. He listened to the line ring. "If Harlan is cooperating and the evidence is submitted and the legal injunction has failed, Voss's only remaining play is to destroy the chain of testimony before the grand jury convenes." "Harlan," she said. "And me." He paused. "And anyone material to the case." The call connected. She heard a voice on the other end, older, clipped, carrying the specific tension of a man who had made a decision he wasn't entirely at peace with. "Carver," Luca said. "How long?" She caught fragments on the other end. "Left the office 40 minutes ago. Private vehicle, not his usual team. 2 men I don't recognize. The Harlan location." "Does he have the Harlan location?" A pause on the line, then, "Yes." Luca ended the call and looked at Emil. "Harlan's deposition location. What did Vega use?" "Field office," Emil said. "Standard intake location for the district. Voss will know it. He's had federal contacts for 20 years. Luca was dialing again. "Vega needs to move Harlan before Voss reaches the field office. She has—" He checked the dashboard clock. 30 minutes, maybe." The call to Vega connected on the first ring. Luca talked for 90 seconds with the focused compression of someone who had a specific amount of critical information and no time for anything that wasn't that. Vega's responses were short and immediate, and when the call ended, Zara could tell from Luca's expression that Vega had already known the situation was accelerating, had already been making adjustments, and that the additional 90 seconds had given her something she needed. "She's moving Harlan," Luca said. "Where?" "She didn't say. Which is the right answer?" The sedan moved through the last flat miles of Indiana and crossed into Illinois with the Chicago skyline building ahead through the snow. Gray on gray, the lake invisible but present, the city's particular winter silhouette like a row of teeth set against the low sky. Zara had been watching Luca's left hand on his knee for the last 40 minutes. The deliberate stillness of it, the way it had been perfectly controlled since Detroit and was no longer quite perfectly controlled. A very small tremor in the fingers, not fear, the body reporting on reserves. "Your ribs," she said. "Later." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have right now." He looked at her briefly. "After." "After what specifically?" He looked at the skyline. "After this is done." She looked at the skyline too. She'd been looking at that skyline her whole adult life from the outside in. From buses and service entrances and the rear-facing windows of hotel corridors, always the skyline as backdrop to someone else's story. It looked different from the front seat of a moving car going toward rather than away. She didn't examine why it looked different. She already knew. They came into the city from the south at 5:43, and Emil navigated without direction, which meant he had a destination already, and Luca had communicated it without her hearing it. The destination turned out to be a parking structure on Walker, 3 blocks from the Federal Building, where Emil pulled into the 3rd level and killed the engine, and they sat for a moment in the sudden quiet. Luca looked at her. "You don't have to come in," he said. "I know. Vega will take your statement tomorrow morning if—" "Luca." She looked at him steadily. "I've been a material witness since the moment I put you in that laundry cart. I was material before I knew what I was material to." She picked up her bag from the floor. "I'm going in." He held her gaze for a moment, then he opened the door. The Federal Building had the specific atmosphere of a place where serious things happened in ordinary rooms. Fluorescent lighting, institutional carpet, the smell of coffee and paper, and the low-grade tension of people managing high-stakes work at the pace their staffing budgets allowed. Vega met them in the lobby with a badge on a lanyard and the expression of a woman who had been having a very long day and expected it to get longer before it got shorter. "Harlan's secure," she said, walking them toward the elevator without slowing. "Different location, different protocol. Voss doesn't have it." She punched the elevator button. "I've got 2 agents sitting on the field office in case Voss moves on the original location. If he does, we'll have him on federal interference with a witness." She looked at Luca. "That's a second charge on top of everything else." "You want him to go to the field office," Luca said. "I want him to make one more bad decision in a string of bad decisions," Vega said. "Yes." The elevator opened. Inside it, for the 4 seconds it took to rise 2 floors, Zara stood between Luca and Vega and felt the full weight of the day pressing down through the soles of her feet into the floor. Detroit and the pharmacy and the highway and the snow and Marcus's face and the photograph on the phone and everything before that, the basement and the bread in the alley, 5 weeks of a story that had been accumulating its mass without her fully understanding the size of it until right now, standing in a Federal Building elevator in wet winter shoes. The elevator opened. Vega led them to a conference room where 3 other agents were already working. Laptops, document stacks, the particular organized density of a federal operation at the point where everything was moving simultaneously. A man Zara didn't recognize was sitting at the far end of the table with a court reporter beside him and a legal pad in front of him, and the hollow expression of a man who had made a decision that changed the shape of his life and was now sitting very still inside that change. Harlan Briggs was 43 years old and looked at today in ways he probably hadn't yesterday. He was compact and precise-featured with the kind of face that had probably read as trustworthy in professional settings. Open, attentive, built for inspiring confidence. It read differently now. Now it read as a face that had been running 2 simultaneous programs for 8 months and had finally stopped, and the stopping showed. He looked at Luca. Luca looked at him. The silence between them lasted 4 seconds and contained everything it contained: 14 months of operational proximity, the relay service, and the location reports, the trust that had been specific enough to be called by its actual name, and the betrayal that had been structural enough that calling it personal was almost beside the point. "I didn't have a choice," Harlan said. Luca pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "You had a choice. You made it 8 months ago when you went to Vega instead of coming to me." He held his gaze. "That was the right choice. It just wasn't a choice you made for my benefit." Harlan looked at the table. "Voss had documentation on my early career work," he said. "Work I did for people I shouldn't have worked for, before I understood what they were. He'd been sitting on it for 2 years. He paused. "When Vega made contact, when the federal case team reached out to me as a potential cooperating witness, I understood that the only way out of Voss's leverage was to get to the other side of the case before he could use it against me." "So you cooperated with Vega," Luca said, "and you stayed in my operation to maintain the intelligence value for the case team, and you fed Voss just enough through the compromised relay to keep him from burning you before the case was ready to move." "Yes." "The relay compromise," Luca said. "The sedan outside Zara's building, the brownstone location. All of that went to Vega's case team, not to Voss." "Yes." "You were building the chain of custody, documenting my location, my associates, my contact with—" Luca paused. "My contact with material witnesses." Harlan looked at Zara for the first time. He looked at her with the specific expression of someone who understood that they had caused harm to a person who didn't deserve it, through a chain of operational decisions that were rational in their own logic and damaging in their human consequence. "I'm sorry," he said. Zara looked at him. She thought about Marcus in the pharmacy for 2 hours, the men on the sidewalk, the photograph on the phone. "Tell the truth in there," she said. She nodded toward the court reporter at the end of the table. "That's all." Harlan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the legal pad. "Yes," he said quietly. Vega came to stand at the head of the table. "We're going to start the formal deposition in 10 minutes. Moretti, I need you in room 4 down the hall. We'll take your statement concurrently." She looked at Zara. "Bennett, my associate agent Cho will take your preliminary statement in room 2. We'll do the formal deposition tomorrow morning." Luca stood up. He looked at Zara. She looked at him. There was something she wanted to say, and she could feel it, the shape of it, something that had been accumulating for 5 weeks in basements and sedans and snow-covered sidewalks. But this was not the room for it, and they both understood that, and she just nodded once, and he held her gaze for 1 second with that look that had moved past calculation a long time ago, and then he walked out with Vega. The preliminary statement took 2 hours. Agent Cho was thorough and unhurried and asked good questions, questions that demonstrated she had read the existing case file carefully and understood where Zara's testimony intersected with and extended the existing evidentiary record. Zara answered everything. She described the alley and the bread and the basement with the same factual directness she'd been applying to difficult things her whole life. Not minimizing, not dramatizing, just the sequence of events as they had occurred and the decisions as she had made them, and the reasoning at the time of each. When Cho asked about the moment she'd decided to bring him inside, Zara was quiet for a moment. "There wasn't really a decision," she said. "He was bleeding and cold and hungry. That was the situation. I dealt with the situation." Cho looked at her. "You understood it was a risk to your employment?" "Yes." "And potentially to your safety." "I understood he was dangerous in some general way. I didn't know the specifics." "But you brought him in anyway." Zara looked at the table, then at Cho. "I've been in situations where I needed help and nobody helped me. I've watched people need help and not get it because the cost of helping was inconvenient." She paused. "I wasn't going to be that person." Cho wrote something on her notepad. "One more thing," Cho said. "The Velvet Crown Hotel. Your employment there for 3 years. At the time, did you have any knowledge of the ownership structure or its connection to—" "No," Zara said. "I knew the hotel was part of a larger management group. I didn't know what was above that." "And if you had known," Zara thought about it honestly, I needed the job, she said. I don't know what I would have done. I'd like to think I would have done something. She looked at the table. But I needed the job. Cho nodded. She wrote that down too. At 9:17 in the evening, the conference room where Harlan's deposition had been running went quiet. Zara was in the hallway outside room 2 when Vega came out of conference, moving with the controlled energy of someone on the back end of a very significant development, and said to no one specifically, Voss went to the field office. The hallway reorganized around this information. Agents Samuels and Park have him, Vega continued, pulling out her phone. Federal interference with a witness proceeding, obstruction, and now we have him physically present at a federal site in an attempt to access protected witness information. She was already dialing. That's everything I needed. Zara sat down on the hallway bench. She sat there for a long time. She thought about Conrad Voss, whom she had never met, whose name she had not known 3 weeks ago, who had built an empire on structures that moved money and moved people and moved neighborhoods, and who had spent 5 years trying to silence the man she'd found bleeding in an alley. She thought about the 400 families. She thought about the people in the trafficking pipelines whose names were in the case documents as reference numbers and might one day be actual names again. She thought about the bread in the trash bag, the 15 pounds of discarded abundance from a table of venture capitalists who hadn't looked at their food. A different world was possible. She'd always understood this theoretically. Tonight it felt like something more material than theory. Luca came out of room 4 at 9:44. He looked like the end of a very long road. The suit was still functional. He maintained appearances the way some people maintained structural integrity out of habit and will rather than vanity. But the left side gave was pronounced now. The ribs past the point where professional bearing could fully compensate. There were shadows under his eyes that she recognized as the specific shadows of a person running on something below actual reserve. He saw her on the bench. He crossed the hallway and sat down beside her. They sat in the fluorescent hum of the federal building hallway for a moment without speaking. Voss, she said. I know. Vega told me. Is it over? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. The case is solid. The grand jury convenes in 11 days with Harlan's testimony, the financial documentation, and the operational records. Voss's arrest tonight adds obstruction charges to a stack that was already significant. He paused. It's over in the way that things are over. The machinery runs from here. People who spent years building the machine spend years dismantling it. Carver, she said. Carver cooperates. He's already in contact with Vega's team. That's why he sent the text tonight. He wants a deal, and he has enough information to earn one. He looked at his hands. Stellan will fight it. Stellan always fights everything. He'll lose. She nodded. The Velvet Crown, she said. The holding company's assets will be frozen during the proceedings. The hotel's day-to-day operations will continue under the existing management group. The staff keeps their jobs. He paused. What happens to the property itself after conviction depends on the asset forfeiture proceedings. I've had conversations with Vega about the possibility of redirecting those assets toward the communities that were displaced in the Eastfield and Wentworth deals. Conversations, she said. Detailed ones, he said, over several months. She looked at him. You planned for this. I planned for the case landing where it's landing. Yes. He held her gaze. I spent 5 years planning for this. And the Hawthorne District. He was quiet for a moment. The Hawthorne District is structurally independent of anything connected to Voss or the case proceedings, he said. It's owned through a clean corporate chain that predates the grand jury investigation and has no evidentiary connection to the charged conduct. It will not be subject to forfeiture. He looked at her. The majority ownership stake is in the name of a holding entity that I set up 14 months ago. When I knew where you were working, when I understood what I wanted to do with what I was building. He paused. Transferring the beneficial ownership of that entity requires one signature from the intended beneficiary. Zara looked at the far wall of the hallway. She looked at it for a long time. You can't give me a district, she said. I'm not giving it to you. His voice was careful and specific. I built it with a governance structure that requires the majority owner to manage it through a board of employees and community representatives. The owner can't extract value from it unilaterally. It's structured as a community development corporation with shared governance. The majority owner has final decision-making authority on strategic questions and serves as public face and executive director. He paused. It needs someone who understands what it means to work in a building and not know who owns it. What it means to earn $12 an hour for a company whose structure you can't see. He looked at her. It needs you specifically, not as a gift, as the only qualified candidate. She turned to look at him. His gray eyes had the qualities she'd been cataloging for 5 weeks, but underneath all the layers she'd identified, underneath the assessment and the calculation and the careful management of what he showed and didn't show, there was something that was simply his face. The face of a man in a federal building hallway at the end of a very long road, making no more attempts to obscure what was there. "Why me?" she said, not challenging, actually asking. "Because you knelt in the snow," he said, "and you didn't want anything for it. And every structure I've ever built was built by people who wanted something for it, including me." He paused. "I wanted to build one thing that started from the other place." She held his gaze. She thought about the eviction notice in her pocket, about 3 years at the Velvet Crown, about Marcus in his 4-room apartment doing his exercises every morning for a lung that would never be what it was, about the bus she'd taken home at 6 in the morning and the rice and the canned beans and the numbers that never worked out no matter how many times she ran them. She thought about the bread in the trash bag. Nobody should starve while rich people throw food away. She'd said it without thinking. She'd meant it as a statement about that specific moment, that specific alley. She hadn't understood it as the thesis of anything. "I don't know how to run a community development corporation," she said. "You know how to work," he said. "You know how to see people. You know what it costs to be invisible in a building that profits from your invisibility." He paused. "The rest is learnable. You're the fastest learner I've ever watched operate." She almost said something about the compliment being convenient given the context. She didn't, because it wasn't a compliment. It was an assessment. She'd been watching him long enough to know the difference. "The signature," she said. "When you're ready, not tonight." He looked at the hallway floor. "Not under fluorescent lights in a federal building at 10 in the evening. When you've had time to read the structure and understand what you're taking on and decide without the weight of today on top of it." She nodded. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay," she said again. More settled this time. He breathed out. Just slightly. The smallest reduction in the structural tension he'd been carrying since... She thought about it. Since the alley, probably. Since the moment someone had knelt in the snow and offered him bread, and he'd understood, somewhere below the calculation, that he was going to owe a debt he didn't know how to pay. They sat in the hallway for another few minutes. The building moved around them. Agents and staff and the procedural machinery of a federal case passing its threshold moment, and they sat in it the way 2 people sat in the aftermath of something large, not talking about it because they were inside it, and language from inside things rarely captured them accurately. Vega came by at 10:15 and said the preliminary proceedings were complete, and the grand jury timeline was confirmed, and she wanted both of them available for follow-up depositions starting at 9 the following morning. Luca said yes. Zara said yes. Vega looked at Luca's left side. She was observant in the way that case agents were observant. She had probably noted the injury 2 hours ago and filed it. "There's a medical unit on the 4th floor," she said. "Not optional." Luca looked like he was going to argue. Vega's expression indicated clearly that the argument was not going to succeed. He went to the 4th floor. Zara sat in the hallway for another 10 minutes and then stood up and walked to the window at the end of the corridor that looked out over the city, the nighttime Chicago skyline, the lake black and vast beyond it, the snow still coming down in the illuminated columns of the streetlights below, the city doing what cities did, moving and lit and indifferent and alive. She stood there for a long time. She thought about Gerald, about the cardboard box on the sidewalk and the 12 witnesses who'd stood there watching. She thought about what it felt like to be unmade publicly, to have the architecture of your livelihood pulled out from under you in front of people who looked away because looking away was survival. She thought about all the Geralds and all the buildings and all the $12 hours. She thought about what it would mean to sit at the top of a building instead of cleaning it, to know the ownership structure, to be the ownership structure. She put her hand in her coat pocket and touched the green wool scarf. She stayed at the window until Luca came back from the fourth floor with his ribs taped under his shirt, and the controlled movement of a man who had been told to rest and had agreed to rest in the specific future tense of someone for whom rest was always a next available window proposition. He came to stand beside her at the window. They looked at the city. "It's going to take years," she said. "Yes. The case, the asset proceedings, the community structures, all of it. Yes. And it's not going to be clean. People are going to fight every piece of it." "Yes," he said. "That's what I've been doing for 5 years. Fighting every piece of it." She looked at the skyline, the particular mix of glass and steel and older stone, the century-long accumulation of a city that had been built and destroyed and built again on the labor of people who mostly didn't own any of it. "When I was 17, she said, "my mother told me that the difference between the people who owned things and the people who worked for them wasn't talent or intelligence. It was starting position." She paused. She said the only way to change starting positions was to be in the room where the starting positions were decided. Luca listened. "I've never been in that room," she said. "I've been cleaning that room. I've been changing the trash bags in that room." She looked at the skyline. "I have opinions about what should happen in that room." Luca looked at her. The ghost of that rusty, almost smile that she'd first seen in the basement, less rusty now after 5 weeks of accumulated use. "I know," he said. She turned to look at him fully. She looked at the scar above his brow, healed clean now, a thin line she'd watched close from the first night. She looked at his gray eyes and the shadows under them and the deliberate set of his jaw that was doing some of the same work his left hand had been doing all day, holding a careful line against what was underneath. "The scarf," she said. "Yes. I'm keeping it." "I know," he said. "I know you are." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned back to the window and the city spread out below them and the snow coming down through the cold Chicago night, the same snow that had been falling the night she'd stepped into an alley with a trash bag and a choice. And she breathed in and breathed out and felt the full weight of 5 weeks settle into something that was not resolution exactly. Resolution was too clean, too complete, too final for what this actually was. But something more honest than that. A beginning that had already cost everything a beginning could cost. A direction that had been built, block by block, from the only starting material available. The bread in the trash bag. The pale blue lips. The gray eyes that had looked at her and asked, with real suspicion, real incomprehension, "Why are you helping me?" And her answer, which she had not prepared and would not change, and which had turned out, against all reasonable expectation, to be the thesis of something after all. 12 months later, the Hawthorne Initiative's first annual report ran 47 pages and was cited in 3 separate congressional testimonies about urban community development models. The report's executive summary was written by Zara Bennett, who had read every page of the corporate structure before signing anything, who had asked questions that Luca's attorneys described afterward as the most rigorous diligence review they had conducted in 20 years of practice, and who had taken the position not because it was offered, but because she had decided, after 3 weeks of careful reading, that it was the right thing to do, and that she was the right person to do it, and that the combination of those 2 facts was sufficient reason. She still remembered employees' names. She still tipped the night janitorial staff personally on late evenings. She had a corner office on the 14th floor of the restored Velvet Crown Tower. The hotel had been acquired through the forfeiture proceedings and restructured as a mixed-use community anchor, its operational staff now holding equity stakes in the building they'd spent years cleaning. And sometimes, in the early mornings before the rest of the floor arrived, she stood at the window and looked at the alley behind the building. Just looked at it, at the dumpsters and the loading dock fluorescents, and the specific angle of the space between the hotel's rear wall and the parking structure, where the snow pooled in winter and a man had once collapsed against a dumpster with pale blue lips and gray eyes, and the particular incomprehension of someone who had never been shown uncalculated kindness. She had a meeting at 9. The board convened at 11. The Construction Oversight Committee for the Eastfield Remediation Project, the housing replacement program that had been built into the forfeiture settlement over Stellan's attorneys' sustained objections and Carver's quiet cooperation, met at 2. Full day. Every day was. She turned from the window and picked up her coffee and her notes and walked to her desk. On the corner of the desk, in a small ceramic bowl that had been Marcus's housewarming gift when she'd moved into the Lincoln Park apartment, 1 bedroom, actual square footage, a lock that worked, the first place in 10 years that she'd been able to afford without running numbers against the eviction clock, sat a green wool scarf, folded small. She didn't wear it anymore. It was too worn for that, the wool compressed and pilled from 3 years of daily use before she'd left it in a hotel basement. She kept it because it was accurate, because it told the true story of where things had started, without sentiment, without mythology. Just the material fact of a cold night and a decision made without enough information and with complete moral clarity. The morning light came through the 14th floor windows in long, flat bars across her desk. Somewhere in the building, a cleaning cart moved along a corridor with the specific rhythm she'd memorized in 2 years of running one. She listened to it for a moment. Then she opened the first file of the day and got to work.